What if I told you that the Federal Reserve, the institution you've been taught stabilizes the American economy, just triggered a countdown to the largest wealth transfer in human history? Not a theory, not speculation, a mathematical certainty. Right now, in 2025, the Fed is executing a strategy so dangerous that it makes the 2008 collapse look like a practice run. They're calling it quantitative tightening and balance sheet normalization. But here's what they're not telling you. They've weaponized the reverse repo market to drain $2.3 trillion in liquidity from the system while simultaneously holding $8.5 trillion in assets they can't sell without detonating the bond market. This isn't economic policy. This is controlled demolition. And you're feeling it right now. Your grocery bill is up 30% since 2020. Your rent is eating half your paycheck. Your savings account loses 4% of its purchasing power every year, while the official inflation rate is a statistical lie. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. But here's the thing. This has all happened before. Same playbook, same lies, same outcome. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I need to know this message is reaching people who are ready for the unfiltered truth. And if you want to understand the financial forces reshaping your life before it's too late, hit subscribe. No clickbait, just the mechanisms they hope you never learn. Let's start with what the Federal Reserve actually is and why 2026 is their end game. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 after a series of financial panics convinced Congress that America needed a lender of last resort to prevent bank runs and stabilize the currency. That's the official story. Here's what actually happened. In November 1910, 7 men took a secret train from New York to Jekyll Island, Georgia. No last names were used. The press was told it was a duck hunting trip. These men represented 1/4 of the world's wealth. J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the Rothschilds' American agent, and representatives from the largest banks in New York. Over 9 days, they drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System, a private central bank disguised as a government institution. When Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act 3 years later, most members didn't even read it. It was rushed through on December 23, 1913, when half of Congress had already left for Christmas. Sound familiar? Fast forward to 2008. The Federal Reserve, operating in near total secrecy, authorized $7.7 trillion in emergency loans to Wall Street banks. Loans the public didn't learn about until a Bloomberg lawsuit forced disclosure 3 years later. No congressional approval, no public debate. Just unelected officials moving trillions of dollars to save the same institutions that caused the crisis. The Panic of 1907 gave us the Federal Reserve. The 2008 crisis gave the Fed unlimited emergency powers, and both were sold to the public as reforms to prevent future disasters. But here's the pattern you need to see. Every Federal Reserve solution creates a bigger crisis down the line. When the Fed was established, the US dollar was backed by gold. 1 ounce of gold equaled $20.67. The promise was simple. Bring your paper dollars to the bank, get gold. Real value. Real constraint on money printing. By 1933, that promise was broken. President Roosevelt made private gold ownership illegal and devalued the dollar by 40% overnight. If you didn't turn in your gold, you faced 10 years in prison. The government confiscated 2,900 tons of gold from American citizens,
and immediately repriced it from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Sound familiar? In 2025, the federal government just proposed new IRS reporting requirements for any crypto transaction over $600. They're calling it tax compliance. But the mechanism is identical. Control the exit, devalue the alternative, force participation in the controlled system. In 1971, Nixon severed the dollar's last tie to gold. Since that moment, the Federal Reserve has operated with zero material constraint. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but trust in a system that has destroyed 98% of the dollar's purchasing power since 1913. And here's where it gets darker. When the Fed was created, total U.S. national debt was $2.9 billion. Today, it's $35 trillion and growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. The Fed owns $8.5 trillion of that debt. They printed money to buy government bonds, which means the government borrowed from a bank that created the money out of nothing. Sound familiar? That's not capitalism. That's not a free market. It's a debt-based control system where the creation of every new dollar requires the creation of new debt. Debt that can never be fully repaid without collapsing the currency itself. And the consequences are accelerating. In the 1920s, the Fed expanded the money supply by 60%, fueling the stock market bubble that imploded in 1929. The Great Depression followed, not because of a lack of regulation, but because of monetary manipulation. In the 2000s, the Fed held interest rates at 1% for years, inflating the housing bubble. When it popped, they responded by dropping rates to zero and printing $4.5 trillion through quantitative easing. Now, in 2025, the Fed has printed over $5 trillion since 2020, inflated the largest asset bubble in human history, and is trying to unwind it without triggering collapse. But they can't, because the system was never designed to be unwound. It was designed to transfer wealth, from savers to debtors, from the middle class to asset holders, from the many to the few. And the mechanism they're using right now is the most dangerous one yet.
Here's what changed in 2023, and why 2026 is the point of no return. The Federal Reserve began the most aggressive interest rate hike cycle in 40 years. In just 18 months, they raised rates from 0% to over 5%. The stated goal: fight inflation. But that's not what's actually happening. When the Fed raises rates, the value of existing bonds, especially long-term treasury bonds, collapses. And who holds more treasury bonds than anyone on Earth? The Federal Reserve. They're sitting on $8.5 trillion in bonds and mortgage-backed securities that are now worth trillions less than what they paid for. The Fed is technically insolvent. But here's the twist. They don't mark their assets to market. They use something called hold-to-maturity accounting, which means they pretend their bonds are still worth full price, even though if they tried to sell them today, they'd take catastrophic losses. This is the same accounting trick that destroyed Lehman Brothers in 2008. Now, at the same time, the Fed has been draining liquidity through the reverse repo facility, a mechanism that allows banks and money market funds to park cash at the Fed overnight in exchange for treasury securities. At its peak in 2023, the reverse repo facility held $2.5 trillion. Today, it's under $200 billion. That's $2.3 trillion in liquidity that's been sucked out of the financial system in less than 2 years. Translation: the Fed raised rates to fight inflation,
But in doing so, they've created a liquidity crisis in the banking system, devalued their own balance sheet, and set up the conditions for a cascading wave of bank failures. And the banks most exposed? Regional and community banks, the ones that lend to small businesses and everyday Americans. The big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, they'll survive. They always do. In fact, they'll expand, just like they did in 2008. But here's the part they're not saying out loud. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. The Federal Reserve isn't trying to save the system, they're consolidating it. And the name behind the strategy? The economist whose model the Fed is following right now? You won't believe the name. But first, you need to understand exactly how this transfer works.
In part 2, I'm going to walk you through the exact financial mechanics the Fed is using to pull off this collapse, step by step, number by number. You'll learn why the inverted yield curve is a mathematical death sentence for the banking system, how the 2023 regional bank failures were just a dress rehearsal, the precise timeline leading to the 2026 trigger event, and the name of the economist whose crisis model the Federal Reserve is deliberately following. This isn't theory, this is the playbook. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Part 2 drops immediately, and it contains the information that will determine whether you protect your wealth or lose everything in the next 18 months. Drop a comment if you're starting to see the pattern, and get ready because what comes next will change how you see money forever. See you in part 2.